Imagine standing on a hilltop in southern Turkey. The year is 10,000 BC. The stars above you are the same stars we see tonight. The air is cool and dry. Below you, firelight flickers against carved stone pillars taller than any person alive. Hundreds of people have gathered here. They have no cities. They have no farms. They have no writing. And yet, somehow, they are building a monument that will not be matched for another 6,000 years. You watch them work by torchlight. They drag limestone pillars weighing 10 tons across the bedrock. They carve animals into the stone with astonishing precision. Foxes, vultures, serpents coiling around the edges. These people are hunter-gatherers. They carry everything they own on their backs. They follow the migration of wild game across the hills. They gather wild grains when the season is right. Nothing in our textbooks says they should be capable of this. Nothing in our models of human progress predicted that people without agriculture, without permanent villages, without any of the things we associate with civilization, would create something so monumental. And yet, here it stands. Göbekli Tepe, older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years. Older than the Egyptian pyramids by 7,000 years. Built before pottery. Built before the wheel. Built before farming itself. This is the paradox at the center of tonight's story. For over a century, we were told a simple narrative. Humans invented agriculture. Agriculture created surplus. Surplus allowed villages. Villages became cities. Cities became civilizations. It was clean. It was logical. It moved in one direction, from simple to complex, from primitive to advanced. Every textbook followed this sequence. Every museum arranged its exhibits along this timeline. And then we found Göbekli Tepe, and the sequence shattered. Because here was monumental architecture before agriculture. Here was organized labor before permanent settlement. Here was symbolic art and ritual before any of the economic foundations we believed were necessary. The question this raised was not small. It was enormous. It reached backward across 12,000 years and asked us to rethink everything we thought we knew about why civilizations begin. Why did ancient humans suddenly build civilizations 12,000 years ago? What changed? What was the trigger? Was it climate? Was it biology? Was it something inside the human mind that finally switched on after 200,000 years of waiting? Or is the word suddenly itself a misunderstanding? Were our ancestors always capable of this, always carrying the seeds of civilization inside them, simply waiting for the right conditions? Tonight, we are going to follow this question wherever it leads. We will cross continents and millennia. We will examine ice cores drilled from glaciers and ancient pollen trapped in lake sediment. We will sit beside archaeologists brushing dust from carved stone in the pre-dawn light. We will listen to geneticists explain what DNA from ancient bones reveals about how our ancestors lived and thought. We will visit the oldest known temples on Earth. We will stand inside structures that were deliberately buried by the people who built them, as though they wanted to hide something from the future. We will challenge the idea that civilization was an invention. We will consider the possibility that it was something more like a phase transition, the way water becomes ice, not gradually, but all at once when conditions cross a threshold. And we will ask a question that sounds simple, but is not. If humans were biologically modern for 200,000 years, with the same brains, the same hands, the same capacity for language and imagination, why did civilization wait so long? The answer, as we will discover, is not what most people expect. It is not a story of human limitation finally overcome. It is a story of a planet that finally held still, of a climate that stopped punishing long-term planning, of social technologies, invisible inventions like trust, ritual, and shared belief that allowed strangers to cooperate at scales never before possible. It is a story of religion before agriculture, of ceremony before economy, of meaning before bread. And it begins not with a great leader or a sudden discovery, but with a slow warming. A world emerging from ice. A sky clearing after millennia of chaos. Tonight, we will explore what happened in that extraordinary window of time, and why the clues still do not entirely add up. So settle in. Let the room grow quiet around you. Let your breathing slow. This is a story 12,000 years in the making, and we have all the time in the world to tell it. The hilltop in Turkey is dark now. The fires have burned low, but the stone pillars still stand, half buried in the earth, waiting for someone to ask the right question. That question is where we begin. Chapter 2. Why this question changes everything. There is a reason this question matters beyond archaeology. It reaches into how we understand ourselves right now. The story of civilization's origin is not just about the past. It is about what we believe humans are. For most of modern history, we carried an assumption. We assumed that hunter-gatherers were primitive. We assumed they lived short, desperate lives, driven by hunger and fear. We assumed civilization was an escape from that desperation. This assumption shaped everything. It shaped how European colonizers viewed indigenous peoples. It shaped how economists model human progress. It shaped how we design our cities, our schools, our governments. If civilization arose because humans finally became smart enough, or organized enough, or desperate enough, then the story confirms a kind of hierarchy. Modern people at the top, ancient people below, progress as a ladder. But what if that is wrong? What if hunter-gatherers were not primitive at all? What if they were fully modern humans with rich inner lives, complex social networks, sophisticated knowledge of their environments, and the cognitive ability to build anything we can build? The evidence increasingly says exactly this. Anatomically modern humans appeared roughly 300,000 years ago. By at least 100,000 years ago, they were creating symbolic art. By 70,000 years ago, they were crafting jewelry, using pigments, and burying their dead with care. Their brains were the same size as ours. Their vocal tracts were capable of full language. Their hands could make anything our hands can make. There was nothing biologically preventing them from building a cathedral. And yet for tens of thousands of years, they did not build permanent structures. They did not plant crops. They did not create cities. This is the mystery. Not that civilization happened, but that it waited so long to happen despite every biological prerequisite being in place. Something else was missing. Something besides raw intelligence and physical capability. If we can identify what that missing ingredient was, we change our understanding of human nature itself. Consider the stakes. If civilization required a genetic mutation, some upgrade in brain wiring that only appeared 12,000 years ago, then our ancient ancestors truly were different from us. Less capable, less aware. But the genetic evidence does not support this. There is no known mutation 12,000 years ago that suddenly enhanced human cognition. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were genetically identical to people living 30,000 years earlier. So the trigger was not biological. It was environmental, or social, or both. This matters enormously, because if civilization is not the product of superior biology but of specific external conditions, then civilization is fragile. It depends on circumstances. Remove the conditions, and it could collapse. We are not inherently civilized. We are conditionally civilized. That realization changes how we think about climate change today. It changes how we think about political instability. It changes how we think about the thin threads holding our modern world together. There is another layer to these stakes. If the conventional story is wrong, if agriculture did not lead to civilization, but instead followed something else, then we have been teaching the wrong origin story for over a century. The conventional story goes like this. Around 12,000 years ago, humans in the Fertile Crescent began domesticating wheat and barley. Agriculture produced food surplus. Surplus freed some people from farming. Those people became priests, soldiers, artisans, and kings. Villages grew into towns. Towns grew into cities. Cities developed writing, law, mathematics, and everything we call civilization. Agriculture was the engine. Everything else was a consequence. This is called the Neolithic Revolution, and it has been the dominant framework since the archaeologist V. Gordon Childe popularized it in the 1920s. But Göbekli Tepe was built before agriculture. Monumental construction came first. Organized ritual came first. The gathering of large groups of unrelated people around a shared symbolic purpose came first. This does not merely adjust the timeline. It inverts the causal story. If ritual and belief systems came before farming, then perhaps farming was not the cause of complex society. Perhaps complex society, the ability to organize, to believe, to cooperate at scale, was the cause of farming. Perhaps people did not settle down because they learned to farm. Perhaps they learned to farm because they had already settled down, drawn together by something more powerful than food. Something like meaning, something like shared story, something like religion. If this is true, it rewrites the deepest chapter of our collective autobiography. It means that the first great human innovation was not a technology. It was a belief. It was the ability to convince hundreds of strangers to work together towards something none of them could eat or wear. It means the foundation of civilization is not economic. It is spiritual. And it means the question we should be asking is not when did humans learn to farm, but when did humans learn to believe in something bigger than themselves, and why did that happen when it did? These are the stakes of tonight's exploration. We are not simply rearranging dates on a timeline. We are asking whether our entire model of human progress has been built on a misunderstanding. If it has, then we need a new model. And that new model might tell us something vital about where we are headed next. So let us go back. Back before the farms and the cities. Back before the first planted seed. Back to the world as it was when the ice began to retreat and the human story took its sharpest turn. Let us begin with the climate. Because 12,000 years ago, the Earth itself changed in a way it had not changed in over 100,000 years. And without understanding that change, nothing else makes sense. Chapter 3. A world locked in ice. To understand why civilization appeared when it did, you must first understand what the world was like before. And the world before was a place of extraordinary harshness and relentless instability. For most of the last 100,000 years, Earth was locked in an ice age. Not a single frozen moment, but a long era of cold punctuated by violent swings. Temperatures lurched up and down without warning. Glaciers 2 miles thick covered much of North America and northern Europe. Sea levels were 300 feet lower than today. Coastlines extended miles beyond their current positions. Entire landscapes that are now underwater were open land. The climate was not simply cold. It was chaotic. Ice core records from Greenland show that temperatures could shift by 10 degrees Celsius in a single decade. These were not gentle transitions. They were shocks. Imagine planning anything in a world like that. Imagine trying to store food for the winter when winters themselves were unpredictable. Imagine trying to stay in one place when the rainfall pattern shifted every few generations. You could not, and humans did not. During the Ice Age, human groups were mobile by necessity. They followed animal herds. They tracked the seasonal availability of plants. They moved across enormous territories, carrying their knowledge in their heads and their tools on their backs. They were not stupid. They were brilliantly adapted. Their survival strategies were sophisticated, honed over thousands of generations. They knew which plants were safe to eat and which were poison. They could read animal tracks like a book. They created art of stunning beauty. The cave paintings at Lascaux and Altamira, dating to around 17,000 years ago, show a level of artistic skill and symbolic thinking that rivals anything in recorded history. They made music. Bone flutes dating to over 40,000 years ago have been found in European caves. They crafted jewelry from shells transported hundreds of miles from their source, evidence of trade networks spanning vast distances. These were modern humans in every meaningful sense. They had language, they had culture, they had imagination. They had everything needed to build civilizations, except stability. The climate would not let them stay. The chaotic swings of the Ice Age made long-term investment nearly impossible. Why build a permanent structure if the river might shift course next decade? Why plant seeds if the rains might fail for 30 years? Long-term planning requires long-term predictability, and the Ice Age offered almost none. This is a crucial point that is often overlooked. We tend to think of civilization as an achievement of human will. We conquered nature, we tamed the wild, we chose to settle down. But the archaeological record suggests something different. It suggests that humans tried many times. There are traces of semi-permanent settlements dating back 30,000 years and more. Small groups lingering in one place for extended periods. Each time, the climate shifted. The resources moved. The people had to move with them. The experiments in settlement failed, not because the people lacked intelligence, but because the planet would not cooperate. Then, around 14,000 years ago, something began to change. The great ice sheets started to melt. Temperatures rose. Rainfall patterns stabilized. The wild grasses of the Fertile Crescent, the ancestors of wheat and barley, began to flourish in dense, predictable stands. But the transition was not smooth. Around 12,800 years ago, just as the warming seemed established, the climate snapped back into cold. This event is called the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near Ice Age conditions lasting over 1,000 years. The cause is still debated. Some scientists point to a disruption in ocean currents. Others suggest a comet impact scattered debris across the northern hemisphere. The evidence for this impact theory grows stronger each year. Whatever the cause, the Younger Dryas was devastating. Communities that had begun to settle were thrown back into crisis. The wild grain field shrank. Animal migration shifted. The brief window of stability slammed shut. And then, around 11,600 years ago, it ended. The cold released its grip for the final time. Temperatures rose sharply, and then, crucially, they stabilized. What followed was the Holocene, the geological epoch we still live in today. And the Holocene was unlike anything Earth had experienced in over 100,000 years. It was warm, yes, but more importantly, it was stable. Temperature variations during the Holocene have been remarkably small compared to the wild swings of the Ice Age. Rainfall became seasonal and predictable. Rivers settled into consistent courses. Ecosystems found equilibrium. For the first time in human memory, the world held still. And in that stillness, something extraordinary began to emerge. Not immediately, not everywhere, but in a handful of places where the conditions aligned, where wild grains grew thick and animals could be managed, humans began to do something they had never successfully done before. They began to stay. This is where our story finds its first turning point. But before we reach the farms and the first villages, we need to examine something that most accounts skip over entirely. Because between the end of the ice and the beginning of agriculture, there is a gap. A gap filled with something unexpected. Chapter 4. The Temple That Came Before the Farm in 1994. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt stood on a rounded hilltop in southeastern Turkey and realized that what everyone had assumed was a medieval cemetery was something else entirely. The hill was called Göbekli Tepe. In Turkish, it means potbelly hill. Local farmers had been plowing around its stones for generations. A survey team in the 1960s had briefly examined it and dismissed it as unimportant. Schmidt saw what they had missed. The stones protruding from the earth were not random rubble. They were the tops of massive T-shaped pillars, carved from single pieces of limestone, deliberately erected in circles. He began to dig. And what emerged from beneath that hill would overturn decades of archaeological orthodoxy. It would force a fundamental rethinking of everything we thought we knew about the birth of civilization. The site contained multiple stone enclosures, each formed by rings of pillars up to 18 feet tall. The central pillars in each ring were even larger, weighing between 10 and 15 tons each. The pillars were not plain. They were covered in elaborate carvings. Foxes, boars, cranes, vultures, scorpions, snakes, and abstract symbols decorated their surfaces. Some pillars had arms carved into their sides, with hands reaching toward their bellies. They were not just columns. They were representations of beings, perhaps ancestors, perhaps spirits, perhaps gods. No one knows for certain, because the builders left no writing. The carvings are all we have. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. These were not rough scratches on stone. They were detailed, confident, artistic. Whoever made them had mastered the techniques of stone carving long before they carved these particular pillars. Schmidt and his team carefully dated the site using radiocarbon analysis of organic material found in the fill between the stones. The dates came back and stunned the archaeological world. The oldest enclosures at Göbekli Tepe dated to approximately 9,600 BC. That is roughly 11,600 years ago. That is before pottery, before metalwork, before domesticated animals, and critically, before agriculture. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers. Analysis of animal bones found at the site showed they were eating wild game, primarily gazelle and aurochs. Analysis of plant remains showed wild grains, not cultivated ones. There was no village at Göbekli Tepe, no houses, no granaries, no evidence of permanent habitation. People came here, probably from great distances, to build and to gather. And then they left. This was a ceremonial site, a ritual center, a place of gathering and shared purpose. It was, by any reasonable definition, a temple, built thousands of years before anything comparable appeared anywhere else on Earth. The implications were staggering. The conventional model said agriculture came first. Surplus came second. Organized religion and monumental architecture came last, as products of settled, complex societies with resources to spare. Göbekli Tepe reversed this entirely. Here was monumental architecture and organized ritual at the very beginning, before surplus, before settlement, before farming. The temple came before the farm. Schmidt himself summarized it with a phrase that became famous in archaeological circles. He said it was not that agriculture led to civilization. It was that the desire to build the temple led to agriculture. Think about what that means. Imagine hundreds of hunter-gatherers converging on this hilltop. They need to eat while they work. Wild game and gathered grain must be brought in massive quantities to feed the labor force. That pressure, the need to feed large gatherings for extended periods, might have been precisely what pushed people toward cultivating wild grasses. Not survival pressure, not famine, but the need to sustain a project of shared meaning. Religion before agriculture. Belief before bread. The spiritual impulse as the engine of civilization. This was revolutionary, and it was deeply uncomfortable for many researchers who had built their careers on the conventional sequence. Debate erupted immediately and continues to this day. Some archaeologists argued that Schmidt was overinterpreting the evidence. Perhaps there were nearby settlements that simply had not been found yet. Perhaps the site served a practical function that was not yet understood. But as excavations continued, more enclosures were revealed. Ground-penetrating radar suggested that only about 5% of the site had been excavated. The full complex might contain 20 or more stone rings. And perhaps the strangest detail of all emerged. The enclosures had been deliberately buried. The builders, or their descendants, had intentionally filled each stone ring with rubble and earth, carefully covering the pillars. They had not abandoned the site carelessly. They had sealed it, preserved it, hidden it beneath the hill as though tucking something precious into the ground for safekeeping. Why would anyone bury a temple they had spent decades building? What were they protecting? What were they preserving? Or what were they trying to contain? No one knows. The burial is one of the deepest mysteries at Göbekli Tepe. It is deliberate. It is methodical. And it means that the people who built these circles held beliefs about these structures that went far beyond simple worship. There is something else. Göbekli Tepe is not alone. In the years since Schmidt's discovery, similar sites have been found across the region. Karahan Tepe, just 30 miles away, may be even older. Its stone pillars include carved human faces with haunting expressions. A pattern is emerging. Across southeastern Turkey and the northern Fertile Crescent, hunter-gatherers were building ceremonial complexes at the very end of the Ice Age. Not in isolation, not as a single anomaly, but as part of a regional phenomenon. Something was happening in this landscape between 12,000 and 10,000 years ago that we do not yet fully understand. A burst of symbolic activity, a scaling up of social cooperation, a transformation in how humans related to each other and to the invisible world. And then, only after this burst of ritual construction, agriculture appeared. As if farming was not the cause of complexity, but its consequence. As if the social and spiritual infrastructure had to be built first before the economic infrastructure could follow. If this interpretation holds, it does not simply adjust the timeline of civilization. It transforms the very definition of what civilization is. It suggests that the foundation was never about food or economics. It was about belief. And yet, this raises an even deeper question, one that will carry us into the next chapter of this story. If hunter-gatherers were capable of building Göbekli Tepe, if they had the cognitive ability, the social organization, and the artistic mastery to create something this extraordinary, then what exactly changed? What made this moment different from the 100,000 years that came before? The answer may lie not in what humans became, but in what the world finally allowed them to be. And the evidence for that answer is frozen in ancient ice, buried in lake sediments and encoded in the DNA of wild grasses that once grew on these very hills. That evidence is where we turn next. Chapter 5. The cracks in the old story. Let us pause here and consider what we have been told. The standard narrative of civilization is so familiar that most people never question it. It lives in every textbook, every museum exhibit, every documentary made before the last 2 decades. The story says that humans wandered as hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years. Then around 12,000 years ago, someone in the Fertile Crescent noticed that seeds could be planted. Agriculture was born. Everything followed from that single insight. It is elegant, it is simple, and it is full of cracks. The first contradiction is timing. If agriculture was simply a discovery, an insight about seeds and soil, why did it take so long? Humans have been watching plants grow for 200,000 years. They understood seasonal cycles intimately. They knew which plants produced edible seeds. They knew where those plants grew best. They carried this knowledge across generations through oral tradition. The idea that no one noticed seeds could be planted until 12,000 years ago strains belief. The botanical knowledge required for early farming was already present in hunter-gatherer communities tens of thousands of years earlier. Archaeobotanists have found evidence of deliberate plant management dating back over 20,000 years in various parts of the world. People were clearing land, encouraging certain plants, and suppressing others long before what we call the agricultural revolution. The knowledge was there. The capability was there. What was missing was not intelligence. What was missing was the incentive. This is the second contradiction. Agriculture, in its earliest forms, was actually worse than hunting and gathering. This sounds counterintuitive, but the evidence is overwhelming. Studies of early farming communities show that their health declined compared to their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Their bones show signs of nutritional deficiency. Their teeth show more cavities from grain-heavy diets. Their average height decreased. Hunter-gatherers typically worked fewer hours per day to obtain food than early farmers did. They ate more diverse diets. They suffered from fewer infectious diseases because they lived in smaller, more mobile groups. The anthropologist Marshall Solins famously called hunter-gatherers the original affluent society. They had abundance not through accumulation, but through desire. They wanted less, and the world gave them enough. So why would anyone voluntarily switch to a harder, less healthy way of life? This is one of the great puzzles of human prehistory, and the conventional narrative has never adequately answered it. The standard response is population pressure. As groups grew larger, hunting and gathering could not support everyone. Farming became necessary despite its disadvantages. People were forced into agriculture by their own success at reproducing. But this explanation has problems too. Hunter-gatherer populations were remarkably stable for thousands of years. They had cultural mechanisms for managing group size, and population pressure would have been a gradual force, not the sudden regional shift we see in the archaeological record. Something else was happening, something the old model cannot explain. The third contradiction involves geography. If agriculture was simply discovered once and spread outward, we would expect to see a single point of origin with gradual diffusion. Instead, we see multiple independent origins across the globe. Agriculture appeared independently in at least 7 different regions. The Fertile Crescent, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, Eastern North America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and New Guinea all developed farming separately, using completely different crops and animals. This pattern does not look like diffusion. It looks like convergence. It looks like something was pushing human societies toward agriculture simultaneously across the planet. Not a shared idea, but a shared condition. That shared condition was almost certainly climate. The end of the Ice Age transformed ecosystems worldwide. But climate alone does not explain the pattern fully. Climate provided the opportunity. Something else provided the motivation. And here is where the anomalies become truly interesting. At multiple sites across the Fertile Crescent, we find evidence of large-scale gathering and ritual activity that predates any sign of farming. Göbekli Tepe is the most famous, but it is not the only example. At Wadi Fangan in Jordan, large communal buildings appeared before domesticated crops. At Jerf el Ahmar in Syria, circular ceremonial structures preceded agriculture by centuries. At Holland Kemi in eastern Turkey, feasting debris suggests large gatherings of unrelated groups. A pattern emerges across all these sites. Social complexity came first. Ritual came first. The gathering of strangers around shared symbolic systems came first. Agriculture followed, sometimes centuries later, almost as an afterthought. This is not what the textbooks predicted. This is not what the old model allows. And for decades, these anomalies were treated as curiosities, exceptions that proved the rule rather than evidence that the rule was wrong. But the exceptions kept accumulating. Site after site, layer after layer, the evidence pointed in the same direction. The social revolution preceded the agricultural revolution. The mind changed before the landscape did. And if that is true, then we need to ask a very different question. Not why did humans invent farming, but why did humans suddenly begin cooperating at scales they had never attempted before? What made strangers trust each other? What invisible technology allowed hundreds of unrelated people to work toward a common goal without kinship bonds to hold them together? The answer to that question may be the most important discovery in the entire story of civilization. And it has been hiding in plain sight, carved into the pillars of Göbekli Tepe, painted on the walls of ancient shrines, and whispered in the oldest myths humanity has ever told. We are approaching something fundamental now, something that challenges not just our timeline but our definition of what it means to be human. The next layer of evidence comes not from the ground, but from the stories our ancestors left behind. Stories that remember what the archaeology is only now beginning to confirm. Chapter 6. What the oldest stories remember. Every ancient civilization on Earth preserved a memory of a time before. A golden age, a lost world. An era of wisdom that was destroyed and had to be rebuilt. We find these stories everywhere. The Sumerians spoke of the Abzu, a primordial realm of knowledge. The Egyptians described Zep Tepi, the first time when gods walked the earth and established the foundations of order. Hindu tradition recalls vast cycles of creation and destruction spanning millions of years. The Greeks remembered a sequence of ages: golden, silver, bronze, and iron, each lesser than the one before. Indigenous Australian traditions speak of the Dreamtime, an eternal creative epoch that shaped the landscape and established all laws. Across the Pacific, Polynesian navigators preserved oral histories of lost lands swallowed by the sea. Native American traditions from multiple cultures describe a great flood and the rebirth of the world afterward. We are taught to dismiss these stories as mythology, as metaphor, as the imaginative projections of people who did not understand the natural world the way we do. But there is a growing recognition among researchers that some myths encode real historical memory. The Australian Aboriginal oral tradition, for example, accurately describes coastal geography as it existed during the last ice age, when sea levels were much lower. These descriptions have been maintained through oral transmission for over 7,000 years, and possibly much longer. This is not mythology in the dismissive sense. This is information preservation across millennia, achieved without writing, using the technology of story. So when multiple unrelated cultures describe a catastrophic event followed by the restart of civilization, we should at least consider the possibility that they are remembering something real. The Younger Dryas, that sudden return to Ice Age conditions around 12,800 years ago, would have been exactly such a catastrophe. A world that had begun to warm suddenly plunged back into cold. Communities that had started to settle were devastated. And then, just as suddenly, the cold ended. The world warmed again. And in the centuries that followed, everything we call civilization began to appear. Is it possible that the oldest myths are remembering the Younger Dryas? That the stories of a lost golden age refer to the brief warm period before the cold snap? That the flood myths remember the massive sea level rise that followed the final melting? Some researchers think so. Graham Hancock has argued for decades that an advanced civilization existed before the Younger Dryas and was largely destroyed by the catastrophic events surrounding it. His claims remain deeply controversial. Most mainstream archaeologists reject the idea of a lost advanced civilization. They point out that no material evidence, no tools, no buildings, no DNA has been found to support such a claim. But between the extreme positions, there is an interesting middle ground. We do not need a lost Atlantis to explain the myths. What we need is an acknowledgement that the transition from Ice Age to Holocene was traumatic, dramatic, and remembered. And what we need is a willingness to consider that the capabilities of pre-agricultural humans were far greater than we have traditionally assumed. Consider the evidence that does not fit neatly into any category. At Göbekli Tepe, the oldest enclosures are the most sophisticated. The craftsmanship of the earliest layers surpasses that of the later ones. The site gets simpler over time, not more complex. This is the opposite of what we expect from a developing civilization. It suggests that the builders arrived with skills already fully formed. They did not learn as they went. They came prepared. Where did they learn those skills? On what structures did they practice before building Göbekli Tepe? Those earlier works, if they existed, have never been found. Perhaps they were built of wood and have rotted away. Perhaps they lie beneath the sea on flooded coastlines. We do not know. And that uncertainty is itself significant. At Karahan Tepe, the sister site to Göbekli Tepe, excavations revealed a carved chamber unlike anything found before. A room with 11 stone figures emerging from the bedrock itself, as though the rock was giving birth to human forms. One figure holds its own head in its hands. The expressions on the faces are serene and deeply unsettling at the same time. This is not primitive art. This is art that communicates across 12,000 years with undiminished power. At Sebruk, another recently discovered site nearby, carved panels show a human figure grasping a leopard and a bull simultaneously. The scene appears to depict a myth, a narrative frozen in stone at the very dawn of the Holocene. These sites are not isolated anomalies anymore. They form a constellation across southeastern Turkey, each one reinforcing the same conclusion. Something remarkable was happening in this region before agriculture. Something involving symbolism, narrative, and shared belief at an unprecedented scale. And the myths that survived from later civilizations in this same region, Sumerian, Babylonian, Assyrian, all point backward to an earlier time. A time of founding, a time of first knowledge. Perhaps they were remembering these very places. Perhaps the oldest stories on Earth are not fantasies at all, but echoes of the moment when humanity first gathered in large numbers around carved stone pillars under an open sky and decided, together, to become something new. The ground beneath our feet is speaking. The stones are speaking. The stories are speaking. And they are all saying the same thing. Something happened here that we have not fully understood, and the stakes of understanding it correctly are higher than most people realize. Chapter 7. The Trap That Built the World. Now we arrive at the part of the story where the ground shifts beneath everything we think we know. Because if the evidence we have examined so far is correct, then civilization was not simply a gift. It was also a trap. Imagine you are a hunter-gatherer living 12,000 years ago in the hills above the Fertile Crescent. Your life is not easy, but it is rich. You know every plant in your territory. You read the sky for weather. You move with the seasons. Your group numbers perhaps 50 people, all of whom you know intimately. Disputes are settled face to face. Decisions are made collectively. No one commands you. No one owns the land beneath your feet. Your diet is varied. Wild grains, nuts, fruits, roots, fish from the rivers, meat from gazelle and deer. You work perhaps 4 to 6 hours a day to meet your needs. The rest is ceremony, storytelling, craft, and rest. You are, by many measures, freer than any human being alive today. Now imagine that something draws you to a gathering place. A hilltop where stone pillars rise toward the stars. People come from many days' walk away. You meet strangers who speak your language, but whom you have never seen before. The gathering is powerful. The rituals create bonds between groups that have no kinship ties. Alliances form. Knowledge is shared. The sense of belonging to something larger than your own band is intoxicating. But feeding everyone is difficult. Wild resources near the gathering site become depleted. Someone suggests encouraging the wild grasses to grow more thickly. Someone begins to tend the plants. Someone begins to stay behind when others leave. This is the beginning of agriculture, not as a brilliant invention, but as a practical necessity driven by the social desire to gather in large numbers for ritual purposes. And here is where the trap closes. Once you begin farming, your population grows. Grain can feed more mouths than wild food. But more mouths require more grain. More grain requires more land. More land requires more labor. More labor requires more children. The cycle accelerates. Within a few generations, your community is too large to return to hunting and gathering. The wild resources that once sustained 50 people cannot sustain 500. You are locked in. The historian Yuval Noah Harari called wheat one of the most successful plants in history, not because humans domesticated it, but because it domesticated us. We became its servants, tending its fields, clearing its competitors, spreading its seeds across continents. Agriculture gave us surplus, yes, but it also gave us hierarchy, inequality, disease, warfare, and environmental destruction. The first cities were also the first sites of epidemic disease. The first granaries were also the first targets of organized theft. The bones tell the story clearly. Early farmers were shorter than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. They had more dental disease. They showed more signs of repetitive stress injuries from grinding grain. Their lifespans did not improve for thousands of years. This is the agricultural trap. Once entered, it could not be exited. The population grew too large. The knowledge of wild food sources faded, and the land itself was transformed beyond recognition by farming. But here is what makes this truly extraordinary. If the evidence from Göbekli Tepe and its sister sites is correct, the trap was not sprung by hunger. It was sprung by meaning. People did not start farming because they were starving. They started farming because they wanted to keep gathering. They wanted to maintain the ritual sites, the social networks, the shared symbolic worlds that gave their lives purpose. They traded freedom for meaning, mobility for belonging. The small intimate band for the large anonymous community held together by shared belief. This is the phase transition. This is the moment when human societies crossed a threshold and could not go back. Not a gradual evolution, but a sudden shift, like water turning to ice, like a flock of birds suddenly wheeling in unison. The conditions had aligned. Climate stability made long-term settlement possible. Social technologies, ritual, myth, symbolic communication made large-scale cooperation possible. And once the process began, population growth made it irreversible. Civilization was not chosen. It crystallized. And once it crystallized, everything changed with astonishing speed. Within 2,000 years of Göbekli Tepe, the first fully agricultural villages appeared. Within 4,000 years, the first towns. Within 6,000 years, the first cities and writing systems. Compared to the 200,000 years of human existence that preceded it, this acceleration is almost instantaneous. It is as though a dam broke and everything poured through at once. But the nature of the trap means that what poured through was not purely beneficial. Civilization brought art, literature, medicine, and law. It also brought slavery, pandemic disease, imperial conquest, and a capacity for destruction on a scale no hunter-gatherer could have imagined. We live inside this trap today, every one of us. We cannot return to hunting and gathering. There are 8 billion people on Earth, and the planet's wild resources could support perhaps 10 million living that way. We are committed to civilization in the way that a river is committed to the sea. The only direction is forward. And this realization brings us to the deepest question of all, the one that has been building since the first chapter of this story. If civilization was not inevitable but conditional, dependent on climate stability and social technology and the fragile architecture of shared belief, then how stable is it really? How close to the edge are we? The people who built Göbekli Tepe eventually buried it. They sealed their greatest achievement beneath tons of earth and walked away. We still do not know why, but there is a possibility that chills the blood. Perhaps they buried it because they understood something we have forgotten. Perhaps they recognized the trap they had created and tried to warn the future. Perhaps those carved pillars, those haunting animal figures, those faceless stone beings with hands folded over their bellies, are not celebrations at all. Perhaps they are monuments to a choice that could not be undone. A choice that led to everything we are. In the next chapter, we will examine what modern science reveals about the precise mechanisms of this transition. We will look at DNA evidence, climate data, and the latest archaeological discoveries that are redrawing the map of human origins. And we will confront a question that researchers are only now beginning to ask openly. Was there something else involved in this transition? Something we have not yet identified? Something hidden in the gap between what hunter-gatherers were capable of and what they suddenly chose to become. The evidence is waiting, and it points somewhere unexpected. Chapter 8. 3 doors into the mystery, we have followed the evidence to a crossroads. The old story of civilization, the neat sequence of agriculture leading to villages, leading to cities, has fractured under the weight of what we have found. Now we must consider what replaces it. 3 competing theories stand at the center of modern debate. Each has evidence in its favor. Each has weaknesses. And each points toward a fundamentally different understanding of what civilization is and why it emerged when it did. The first theory is the climate trigger hypothesis. This is the most widely accepted explanation among mainstream scientists. It argues that the end of the last ice age created conditions uniquely favorable for agriculture and settlement. The Holocene brought unprecedented climate stability. For the first time in over 100,000 years, temperatures remained within a narrow band for thousands of years. Rainfall became predictable. Wild grains flourished in dense stands across the Fertile Crescent. This stability made long-term planning possible. You could plant a seed and reasonably expect to harvest it months later. You could build a structure and expect the river not to shift course within your lifetime. The climate trigger theory is powerful because it explains the timing precisely. Civilization did not emerge during earlier warm periods because those periods were too brief and too unstable. Only the Holocene offered the sustained predictability that agriculture and settlement required. It also explains the global pattern. Multiple independent origins of agriculture across the world make sense if the trigger was a planetary climate shift rather than a single human invention spreading outward from one point. The weakness of this theory is that it treats humans as passive responders to environmental change. Climate provided the opportunity, but opportunity alone does not explain action. Many species benefited from Holocene stability. Only humans built civilizations. Something specific to human psychology and social organization must have been involved. Climate is necessary, but not sufficient. The second theory is the social brain hypothesis, sometimes called the cultural ratchet theory. It argues that the key innovation was not agricultural, but social. Humans developed new forms of cooperation that allowed strangers to work together at unprecedented scales. Robin Dunbar's research suggests that human brains can maintain stable social relationships with roughly 150 individuals. Beyond that number, personal bonds are insufficient to maintain group cohesion. Larger groups require something else. That something else is what anthropologists call social technology. Shared myths, rituals, symbols, and belief systems that create trust between people who do not know each other personally. Religion is the most powerful example of such technology. The social brain theory argues that the ritual sites like Göbekli Tepe represent the moment when humans first deployed these social technologies at scale. Large gatherings around shared sacred symbols allowed cooperation beyond the limits of personal familiarity. Once this threshold was crossed, everything else followed. Large groups could coordinate labor. They could defend territory. They could share information across wider networks. The agricultural revolution was a downstream consequence of this social revolution. The evidence for this theory is compelling. The archaeological sequence at multiple sites shows social complexity preceding agriculture. Ritual architecture comes before granaries. Ceremonial gathering comes before permanent settlement. The social transformation leads, and the economic transformation follows. The weakness is that it raises its own question. Why did social technology scale up 12,000 years ago and not earlier? Humans had ritual behavior and symbolic thought for tens of thousands of years before Göbekli Tepe. What changed? The third theory is the most radical and the most controversial. It is the phase transition model. It argues that civilization did not emerge from any single cause, but from the simultaneous alignment of multiple conditions crossing a critical threshold. In physics, a phase transition occurs when a substance changes state. Water becomes ice, not because any single molecule changes, but because the collective behavior of all molecules shifts simultaneously when temperature drops below a critical point. The phase transition model suggests that human civilization works the same way. Cognitive capacity, climate stability, population density, social technology, and ecological conditions all had to align simultaneously. When they did, the shift was sudden and irreversible. This model explains why civilization appeared to emerge so abruptly. It was not a gradual climb, but a sudden crystallization. All the ingredients were present for thousands of years, like supercooled water, waiting for a single disturbance to trigger freezing. The beauty of this theory is that it honors complexity. It does not reduce civilization to one cause. It acknowledges that the phenomenon was overdetermined, the product of many forces converging in a narrow window of time. The challenge is that phase transition models are difficult to test. They describe emergent behavior that cannot be reduced to simple cause and effect. They are elegant but resistant to the kind of falsification that science prefers. Each theory illuminates a different facet of the mystery, but none of them alone captures the full picture. And recent discoveries are adding layers of complexity that none of these theories fully anticipated. What we need is not a choice between theories, but a synthesis. And that synthesis is beginning to take shape in laboratories and excavation sites around the world right now. Chapter 9. What the New Science Reveals. In the last decade, 3 scientific breakthroughs have transformed our understanding of the transition to civilization. Each one has complicated the story further. Each one has brought us closer to something resembling the truth. The first breakthrough comes from ancient DNA analysis. Geneticists can now extract and sequence DNA from human bones thousands of years old. The results have been revolutionary and frequently surprising. Ancient DNA from the Fertile Crescent reveals that the earliest farming communities were not a single population. They were a mixture of genetically distinct groups that had been separated for thousands of years during the Ice Age. As the ice retreated, these previously isolated populations came into contact. They mixed, they merged, and in the process, they created communities with unprecedented genetic diversity and, presumably, unprecedented cultural diversity as well. This mixing may have been crucial. Different groups brought different knowledge, different skills, and different traditions. The combination created something none of them could have produced alone. Innovation thrives at the intersection of different ways of knowing. The DNA also confirms something important. There was no genetic revolution 12,000 years ago. No new mutation appeared that enhanced human intelligence or capability. The people who built the first monuments were biologically identical to people living 50,000 years earlier. Whatever changed, it was not our bodies. It was not our brains. It was the context in which those bodies and brains operated. The second breakthrough comes from paleoclimate science. New high-resolution climate records from ice cores, lake sediments, and cave formations have revealed the Holocene transition in extraordinary detail. What these records show is that the transition was not smooth. The Younger Dryas cold snap was more severe and more sudden than previously understood. In some regions, temperatures dropped by as much as 15 degrees Celsius within a single generation. Then, when the Younger Dryas ended around 11,600 years ago, the warming was equally abrupt. Within decades, temperatures rose to near modern levels and then, crucially, stabilized with a consistency that had not occurred in over 100,000 years. This creates a fascinating paradox. The Younger Dryas was devastating, but it may have been necessary. The cold snap compressed human populations into refuge areas, forcing previously isolated groups into close contact. It was a crucible. When the cold ended and the world opened up again, these compressed, mixed, culturally enriched populations exploded outward into a landscape of unprecedented abundance and stability. The pressure of the Younger Dryas may have forged the very social bonds that made civilization possible. destruction as prerequisite for creation. The myth of the flood followed by renewal may encode exactly this sequence. The third breakthrough comes from archaeology itself. The discovery that Göbekli Tepe is not unique but part of a vast network of contemporary sites has fundamentally changed the scale of the question. In 2021, excavations at Karahan Tepe revealed structures even more remarkable than Göbekli Tepe. A chamber carved into bedrock contained rows of phallic pillars and a single human figure emerging from the stone wall with a haunting, almost alien expression. At Seberg, a carved panel depicts a narrative scene, a human figure grasping a leopard and a bull. This is storytelling in stone, 12,000 years old. At Bangkoklu Tarla, stone pillars and beads suggest ritual practices even older than Göbekli Tepe. Ground-penetrating radar surveys across the region suggest that dozens more sites remain unexcavated. What we have uncovered so far may represent a tiny fraction of what exists beneath the surface. This changes the picture dramatically. We are not looking at a single anomalous site. We are looking at a civilization-scale phenomenon, a regional network of ceremonial centers connected by shared symbolism and mutual exchange. Hunter-gatherer groups across hundreds of miles were participating in a common symbolic culture. They were coordinating. They were communicating. They were building a shared world of meaning that transcended any individual community. This is the paradox that current science cannot fully resolve. These people had no writing, no wheeled transport, no metal tools. And yet they organized a construction program spanning an entire region, involving thousands of individuals, sustained over centuries. How? What held them together? What motivated them? What system of coordination allowed this to happen without any of the administrative technologies we consider essential for large-scale cooperation? The answer that keeps emerging from every line of evidence is the same one. Belief, shared symbolic systems, sacred narratives, the invisible architecture of meaning that makes strangers into allies and turns individual labor into collective purpose. But this answer raises one final question, the question that has been building since the beginning of this story. If belief was the catalyst, if shared ritual and symbolic thought were the technologies that enabled civilization, then where did those beliefs come from? What were the people at Göbekli Tepe actually doing? What did the carved pillars mean to them? And why, after centuries of building, did they bury everything and walk away? The answer to these questions may be the most important revelation in the entire story of human origins. And it has been staring at us from the stone the entire time. Chapter 10. What the pillars were trying to say. Let us return one final time to that hilltop in southeastern Turkey. The stars are out. The carved pillars stand in their circles. And now, with everything we have learned, let us look at them with new eyes. The T-shaped pillars at Göbekli Tepe are not abstract architecture. They are anthropomorphic. They have arms carved along their sides. They have hands with fingers that reach toward their bellies. Some wear belts with foxes hanging from them. They are representations of beings. Not ordinary people, but something more. Ancestors, perhaps. Spirits. Archetypal figures embodying qualities that the community valued or feared. They stand in circles, facing inward, as though in council. Around and between these central figures, animals swarm. Foxes, snakes, boars, cranes, vultures, scorpions, spiders. Not domesticated animals, wild ones, dangerous ones. Liminal creatures that inhabit the boundary between the human world and something other. The iconography is not decorative. It is systematic. Certain animals appear repeatedly in specific associations. The vulture appears with headless human figures. The snake appears in contexts suggesting transformation or boundary crossing. Researchers like Klaus Schmidt and his successors have interpreted these symbols as elements of a cosmological system, a shared understanding of the structure of reality that united the groups who gathered here. This was not simple nature worship. This was theology, a complex, layered system of meaning that organized the visible world into categories and assigned significance to the relationships between them. And here is the revelation that changes everything. The pillars are not gods to be worshipped. They are concepts to be shared. They are the physical manifestation of a symbolic language that allowed strangers to inhabit the same mental universe. They are social technology made stone. Think about what money is. It is a shared fiction. A piece of paper or metal that has value only because everyone agrees it does. Without that shared agreement, money is worthless. The agreement itself is the technology. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe worked the same way. They were physical anchors for shared beliefs. When people from distant regions converged on this hilltop, the pillars told them they belonged to the same story. The carvings provided a common symbolic vocabulary. You did not need to know someone personally to trust them. You needed to recognize the symbols. You needed to share the story. You needed to stand in the same circle and know that the carved beings watching from the pillars were watching you both. This is the invention that made civilization possible. Not farming, not pottery, not the wheel. The invention of shared fictional worlds that combined strangers into cooperative groups larger than any kinship network could sustain. Yuval Noah Harari calls this the cognitive revolution. Others call it the symbolic revolution. But whatever name we give it, the evidence now suggests it reached a critical threshold precisely here, precisely now, 12,000 years ago. The phase transition model suddenly makes perfect sense. Climate stability provided the conditions. Population mixing provided the diversity. And shared symbolic systems provided the social glue. All three aligned simultaneously, and civilization crystallized. It crystallized not because humans became smarter, not because someone invented agriculture, not because of any single cause. It crystallized because a constellation of conditions crossed a threshold together, and the result was an irreversible transformation of human life on Earth. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe are the earliest surviving evidence of this threshold being crossed. They are not primitive attempts at art. They are the first monuments of a new kind of human existence. They mark the moment when we stopped being small bands of relatives and started becoming societies of strangers held together by invisible bonds of shared meaning. And the burial? Why did they bury it all? Perhaps because the technology worked too well. Perhaps because the gatherings grew too large, the population too dense, the demands of feeding everyone too great. Perhaps agriculture, the trap, closed around them, and the world they had built at Göbekli became impossible to sustain. Perhaps they buried the pillars because the era they represented was over. The age of voluntary gathering had given way to the age of permanent settlement. The circles of carved stone belonged to a world that could not survive its own success. They sealed their temple not in abandonment but in reverence. They buried it the way you might bury a beloved ancestor, with care, with intention, with the hope that someone in the future might understand. 12,000 years later, we uncovered it. And we are only now beginning to understand what they were trying to tell us. Civilization is not a ladder. It is not a march from primitive to advanced. It is a phase state, a crystalline structure of cooperation and shared belief that can form suddenly when conditions align and can shatter just as suddenly when those conditions fail. We are living inside that crystal right now. Our money, our laws, our nations, our religions are all descendants of those first carved pillars. They are shared fictions made real through collective belief. And like any phase state, ours depends on conditions. Climate stability, social trust, shared narratives that bind strangers together. Remove any of these, and the crystal dissolves. The people of Göbekli Tepe knew this. They lived through the Younger Dryas. They watched the world collapse and rebuild. They understood, perhaps better than we do, how fragile the architecture of cooperation truly is. Their buried pillars are not just archaeological artifacts. They are a message, a reminder carved in stone and sealed in earth. Civilization is precious. Civilization is conditional. And civilization must be tended like a fire in the dark, or it will go out. It is late now. The stars have shifted overhead. The story we have followed across 12,000 years is drawing to a close, but the mystery itself remains open. It will always remain open. That is its nature. We asked why ancient humans suddenly built civilizations. The answer is that they did not suddenly become capable. They were always capable. What changed was the world around them and the invisible technologies of belief and belonging they forged in response. Climate stability gave them the stage. Shared ritual gave them the script. And population pressure sealed the performance into permanence. Civilization was not invented. It crystallized from conditions that had never before aligned on this planet. But the deepest lesson is not about the past. It is about us. We are still those same humans, carrying the same brains, the same capacity for cooperation and destruction. Our civilization rests on the same fragile foundations that theirs did. Somewhere beneath a hill in Turkey, stone pillars still stand in their circles, waiting in the darkness, holding the memory of the first time strangers chose to build something together. They stood before agriculture. They stood before cities. They stood before writing could record their purpose. And they stand still. If this story stayed with you tonight, if it changed even slightly how you see the ancient world and our place within it, consider subscribing to this channel. There are more mysteries waiting beneath the surface, and we will explore them together, one quiet night at a time.